Chapter 3: Judah's Primitive Pre-Invasion Religion. In a recent paper in the scholarly journal Judaism, Sarah Japhet, the Hazael Kaufman professor of the Bible at the Hebrew University, makes this penetrating observation. The deliverance of Jerusalem from the Assyrian threat in the days of Hezekiah and the contrast between its survival and destruction of the kingdom of Israel may be seen as the seed which would grow and flourish in later generations into a new theology of election. Emphasis added. Election is the belief that a deity has elected or chosen individuals or a collectivity as its own. It is the idea that enabled Hebrews to see themselves as the chosen people. The Hebrew Bible does not smugly present the idea as an expression of divine favoritism. Rather it shows it as including a dimension of responsibility, of having a sense of mission in the world. In the Hebrew Bible, Yahweh says that his people will serve as a light to the nations, so that all the world may be saved. As H.A. Rowley, professor of Hebrew language and literature at the University of Manchester in England, puts it, that Israel was the chosen people and that she was chosen for service is the clear teaching of the Old Testament as a whole. Election is one of the most influential ideas in religious history. Christianity and Islam have also adopted the concept. In the Christian tradition, Jesus' birth is the fulfillment of the history of the chosen people. Rowley comments, throughout the New Testament, the term elect is found many times for the church, testifying to the belief that the church was the elect of God. Yet, never is this election thought of as rival to that of Israel, but as a continuation of that election, to which the church has become heir. This concept was particularly strong in the 16th century reformer John Calvin and with English and American Puritans. They saw themselves as the elect. God's choice of them had nothing to do with human worth and everything to do with God's mercy. The few members of the elect would be saved, but the majority of humanity would face eternal damnation. Among Muslims, some Sufis also have a comparable sense of election. To use Japhet's imagery, Jerusalem's miraculous rescue was the seed that would transform the Hebrew identity. To appreciate the deliverance's profound effect on the Judeo-Christian tradition, we need to understand the religious and intellectual soil into which it fell. According to the traditional view of biblical history, Moses set in motion the idea of monotheism, the belief that there is only one deity. In the course of the journey that brought the Israelites from Egypt to the Promised Land, the prophet climbed Mount Sinai, where he received from Yahweh the covenant. This, of course, is the great pact through which the Hebrews became the chosen people. Yahweh instructed Moses to pass this message on to his followers. If you obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession out of all the peoples. A crucial word here is if. So long as the people are faithful to Yahweh, then he will treasure them so that they will know only prosperity and success. When they are disobedient, calamity will strike them. 3 days later, Yahweh made clear what obedience entailed. He decreed the 10 Commandments and many other laws. In presenting the story of the Hebrew people, the Bible describes the ups and downs of Israel and Judah in a way that reflects their respect or disrespect for this pact. David and the young Solomon are both pious, and under them the Hebrew state accordingly attains greatness. When later in his reign Solomon slides into worship of other gods, the kingdom's fortunes plunge. Because most subsequent monarchs of both Israel and Judah also stray from loyalty, Yahweh brings adversity to their people. When, 2 centuries after Solomon's time, Hezekiah arrives on the Judaic throne, this decline ends abruptly. That is because, suggests the Bible, Hezekiah held fast to the Lord. He did not depart from following him, but kept the commandments that the Lord commanded Moses. Well before Sennacherib's invasion, according to the Bible, the young king would have ordered the destruction of the places where his subjects worshipped other gods, and allowed only one place of worship in his entire realm, that of Yahweh of Jerusalem. It is because of Hezekiah's prior loyalty to him that Yahweh protects Jerusalem from the Assyrians. It goes without saying that this traditionalist view considers the faith of Moses, David, and Hezekiah to have been monotheistic. The Bible ascribes David, the poetic warrior, the authorship of many of the Psalms, including the famous 23rd Psalm that begins, "The Lord is my shepherd." These psalms are, of course, commonly used for monotheistic devotion. As well, the Bible says that David's son, King Solomon, then built the temple, Jerusalem's first great place of worship for Yahweh, atop Jerusalem's hill, Zion. Yet, in approaching this period, it is better to set aside the familiar versions of Judaic religion. In recent decades, all but the most inflexible traditionalist scholars have come to reject the idea that the faith would have been so developed by Hezekiah's reign. Even those conventional scholars who consider Moses and David to be authentic historical figures are part of this consensus. Most would say that Moses himself would have not been monotheistic. The first commandment does not say, "I am the one and only deity." Rather, its particular wording, "You shall have no other gods before me," assumes that other gods exist. Some scholars who believe David was a real king of the 10th century BC would acknowledge that he has no connection to the 23rd Psalm, that the psalm dates from well after the events of 701 BC. Far more agreement exists between the covenantal and minimalist perspectives in regard to the religious currents of around 701 BC and of the late 8th century BC generally, than to several centuries that followed it. Than to the several centuries that followed it. Politically weak as we have seen the Judahite society to have been in the years immediately prior to the invasion, scholars of both schools would concur that the status of Yahweh as the one God would have been weaker still. If pious Yahwehists from Jerusalem several centuries after Sennacherib's invasion could travel back in time and visited their city in the months leading up to the crisis, they would have found the local religion almost unrecognizable. Many concepts and practices in which the visitors would have been familiar would not yet have emerged. They would have found, for example, no synagogues, no observance of the Sabbath for the purpose of worship, and no circumcision. The visitors would have encountered little, possibly no worship of Yahweh to the exclusion of other gods. Most scholars now say the belief in a single universal deity would have only crystallized during the time of the exile in the 6th century BC. Some minimalist historians push the date further forward, saying that it would have emerged gradually in the course of the 5th to 2nd century BC. A specialist on the period, Morton Smith of Columbia University, sums up the prevailing view of Judah's religious climate of the 8th century BC this way. Although the cult of Yahweh is the principal concern of the Old Testament, it may not have been the principal religious concern of the Israelites. Following common practices, he employs the term Israelites for the people of Israel and Judah alike. Smith stresses the general attitude of the population was to worship Yahweh in addition to other gods, notably those of the Canaanite and Philistines, such as Baal and Asherah. Starting in the early 9th century BC, a movement may have grown for the exclusive worship of Yahweh, but this current, which Smith calls the Yahweh alone movement, would not have emerged from its minority status until long after the events of 701 BC. Because the movement acknowledges the existence of other deities, even if it only worshipped one, it was not really monotheistic. For minimalists, the Yahweh is alone movement would have not existed even as a minority faith for still some time. This distinction, however, is but a nuance. Whether a few Judaites or none at all worshipped Yahweh as the sole deity, what is clear is that the vast majority of Judaites in 701 would have been polytheists. Indeed, compared to its neighbors in core, the Hebrew nation in religion and culture was hardly very unusual. Smith suggests that Judah in this period was about as distinct as an entity as Austria is today within Europe. Of the Hebrew nations, he says, there was a nucleus of persons united by the common interests, common language, common traditions, common religious feelings, loyalty to local shrines and to the national god, and such ethnic uniformity as can be produced by the amalgamation of many elements, but on every side the nucleus blended into surrounding populations. Minimalists would emphatically agree. Monotheistic Hebrews from several centuries later would also have been surprised at the manner in which the Judahites of 701 BC worshipped Yahweh. In Jerusalem, the sacrifice of animals and grains would have dominated the act of worship. The poor brought grain, and those who could offer sheep, goat, and bulls. Under Hezekiah, this practice would have flourished. The quantity of beasts slaughtered was seen as a measurement of devotion. People believed that they could earn the favor of Yahweh the same way that they could win that of another god, of other gods, by saying the right words in the holy places and presenting the right gifts for sacrificial burning. Isaiah was particularly incensed by what he saw as a moral void among the governing class, a depravity that was evident to him in the exploitative way that class treated the poor. Micah, the only other biblical prophet preaching in Judah this time, was just as severe in his criticism of the religious establishment, saying its priests give direction to return for a bribe. Its priests give direction in return for a bribe. Yet Isaiah and Micah's insistence that the religion demand good work and righteousness in the adherent's heart was strictly a minority view. If chagrined by immoral behavior, the Yahwehist visitors from later centuries invoked Moses' law to reprove Judaites of Hezekiah's day, they would have probably received puzzled looks. While a figure called Moses may have been well known in Hebrew traditions in Hezekiah's time, many reputable scholars believe that it's unlikely that his laws had yet revolutionized mainstream Hebrew thought. The Ten Commandments, in particular, they say, may date from no earlier than the 7th century BC. Minimalists put that date later still. Indeed, if the visitors sought to invoke the authority of some other sacred writings, they would have been hard-pressed to put their hands in any other, either ancient or recent. No Bible existed at the time, nor was there any other form of canon or text believed to be the word of Yahweh. Referring to the text of Isaiah, among many others, Robert Pfeiffer, an Old Testament scholar at Harvard University, observes, some of these ancient writings are literary masterpieces, but none of their authors expected to have their books canonized as scripture. In later centuries, individuals whose identities are unknown edited the old existing scrolls or composed new ones. Eventually, circumcision would have been widely seen as a symbol of the covenant, but circumcision could not have carried the symbolic dimension during Hezekiah's reign for the simple reason that the covenant, as we know of it, did not yet exist. Contrary to the widespread understanding, Moses' doctrine of the covenant did not originate with a 3rd century BC figure named Moses, a 13th century figure BC. Moses' doctrine of the covenant did not originate with a 13th century BC figure named Moses. As Anoch Revive notes, Yahwehism was only able to add the instructive novelty of the covenant in the late 7th century BC. Pfeiffer declares unequivocally that every mention in ancient scripture of Yahweh's covenant with Israel is later than the late 7th century BC. We can understand then why the self-identity of Hebrews as God's chosen people had not yet emerged by 701. Sheldon Blank, professor of the Bible at Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati, points out that the writing of the original prophet Isaiah shows that he knew nothing of a chosen people. Some scholars like Chpt dated the full emergence of this sense of election to the late 7th century during the reign of Josiah prior to the exile. Others place it in the 6th century BC during the exile, and still others, the minimalists, maintain that it would have come after the national ordeal. It is this fundamental matter of religious vocation that these visitors may have felt themselves to be the most different from their ancestors in Hezekiah's time. The visitors would have been Jews. The people of Judah in 701 BC were not. The term Jew came into being to describe the followers of Judaism. Covenantal historians think that Judaism only took form about a century and a half. The process was gradual after Hezekiah's reign, reaching a recognizable identity during the exile with the emergence of monotheism. To minimalists, the date might have followed the exile by 3 or even 4 centuries. Several closely related developments then occurred in several centuries after the deliverance. The understanding of the covenant, the sense of divine election, and the belief in the primacy of Moses' law. These we must add another to these we must add another building block in the development of Western thought, the composition of the history of the ancient Hebrews from the time of Moses onward to the exile. 6 books of the Bible recount that history. They are the books of Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, and 1st and 2nd Kings. Their version of events show how Yahweh controls history. All 6 reflect the just desert philosophy. The just searched philosophy. That is, when the leader of the Hebrew people turns their back to Yahweh and his laws, disaster occurs. And when they are loyal to him, only good things happen. The failure of Sennacherib's invasion, for example, demonstrates that when Hebrew society, starting with its monarch, honors Yahweh, society and monarch alike are immune to misfortune. To try to discover what really happened in 701 and to grasp its effect on later religious thinking, we have to understand how this philosophy of history influenced our principal biblical source for the Assyrian invasion. That source is the last of these 6 books, the book of 2nd Kings. The author editors of 2nd Kings transformed the story of the Assyrian invasion from a grave political misadventure to a theological event of the first magnitude, from a close call to the deliverance. Ronald Clement says that the invasion forms a kind of high point in the whole story of the monarchy, which spans the last 4 of those 6 books. Scholars call the 6 books the Deuteronomistic history. Their term for this viewpoint is Deuteronomic philosophy. These terms come from the book of Deuteronomy, the biblical text that immediately precedes the 6 books of Deuteronomistic history, and that inspires all of them. The Deuteronomist history tells of the dramatic discovery of the book of Deuteronomy in the 18th century of Josiah's reign. In the 18th year of Josiah's reign, which would have been 622 BC, workmen who were repairing the Temple of Solomon, says 2 Kings, when the high priest came across a scroll that apparently had been concealed inside the edifice. The scroll was ostensibly centuries old. Its text contained Moses' farewell speech to his followers just prior to his death. In it, Yahweh, speaking through Moses, describes a law to which he wanted his followers to adhere. Among these are the 10 Commandments. The Bible presents these sacred imperatives in 2 places, here and in the book of Exodus. But many scholars agree that this lesser-known Deuteronomy version is the older of the 2. The Deuteronomistic history presents this fortuitous find as a turning point in the Hebrew history. It says that Josiah, upon learning the content of the scroll, was so appalled at how his kingdom had departed from Moses' instruction that he at once purged his realm of paganism. He put the kingdom back on Yahweh's path, from which, according to the Bible, it had strayed after the end of Hezekiah's reign. Covenantal historians say the scroll was in fact written relatively soon before its discovery in 622. Some suggest the core of the text dates from immediately prior to 622. Others say that it was written in a few decades before, and still others speculate that the thinkers in Israel might have composed it before the kingdom's collapse in 720. While covenantal scholars recognize the theological coloration of these Deuteronomistic accounts of Hebrew history, they tend to accept much of the factual information that these texts contain. Minimalists are doubtful. Some of them suggest that King Josiah was no great religious reformer, and that whatever innovation that he did bring in would have been mostly administrative. Although the book of Second Kings extols Josiah for promoting the scroll's lofty ideals, a skeptical Philip Davies of the University of Sheffield in England dates the composition itself of the book of Deuteronomy to the 6th or even the 5th century BC, long after the lifetime of this supposed great royal patron. If this late origin is correct, it would further suggest that the value of exercising caution when trying to reconstruct the events of 701 on the basis of the main biblical source, the Deuteronomistic history. On the eve of the Assyrian crisis, then, Judah's religious soil had little to distinguish it from other nearby peoples. The only surviving texts from contemporary intellectuals are the declarations of Isaiah and his fellow prophet Micah, who preached in the hill country near Lachish. Both men saw the society as a squalid and richly meriting the devastation that Sennacherib was about to inflict upon them. When, despite the success in which the Assyrians had exterminated Israel in 720 and had overcome neighboring kingdoms in 701, Sennacherib failed completely at Jerusalem. One can appreciate why successive generations of amazed Judahites would have asked themselves, "Why us?" It is in this searching intellectual climate that the seeds of chosenness would germinate.